There's a silent war every man fights, not with his fists in some back alley, nor with ledger books against some bigger corporation, but right there between his own two ears. It's a fight against the doubt that whispers, the fear that screams, and the insidious belief that you just ain't good enough. Some men win that war early, some lose it outright and spend their lives watching the world pass them by. And then there are men like Curtis. Men who lost everything to the internal enemy, only to rise from the ashes, armed with a conviction so fierce it could bend steel. They learn the hard way that the only real empire you gotta build is the one in your own mind, where you're the king, not the jester. Take Curtis, for instance. 48 years old, and you'd find him most days under the hood of a Ford F-150 or wrestling with a seized-up transmission on a beat-up Silverado. He's a mechanic through and through, the kind of man whose natural habitat is the gritty, oil-stained concrete floor of a garage, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and hot metal. He's built like a working man's blueprint. Broad shoulders, a solid frame that speaks of years spent lifting, pushing, and pulling heavy things. His hands, though, are what tell the real story. They're thick and calloused, knuckles scarred, the nails perpetually rimmed with dark grease, no matter how much he scrubs them at the end of the day. They're the hands of a man who knows how to fix things, who takes pride in the precise application of force and skill. But it's his eyes that hold your attention. They're a deep, almost unreadable blue, usually quiet and observant, taking in everything without giving much away. There's a certain intensity to them, a depth that hints at a man who has seen a lot, felt a lot, and wrestled with more than just stubborn bolts. He's not one for small talk, not the type to crack jokes just to fill the silence. When Curtis speaks, the words are usually few, weighed carefully, and carry the ring of honesty. He doesn't waste breath, and he doesn't suffer fools gladly, but beneath that gruff, reserved surface, there's a bedrock of fairness that anyone who knows him can vouch for. He'll tell you straight, even if it's what you don't want to hear, but he'll also go the extra mile to make sure a job is done right, because that's just how Curtis operates. He moves with a quiet confidence now, a man at peace with his purpose, but the ghost of an older, more hesitant self sometimes flickers in the deeper shadows of those blue eyes, a reminder of the path he's traveled to get here. Every morning, long before the sun had fully chased the night from the sky, the relentless shriek of an alarm clock would rip through the quiet of Curtis's modest, single-story house. 5 a.m. Always 5. Not 4, not 6, but 5, a number that felt as ingrained in his bones as the ache in his lower back. His feet would hit the worn linoleum of the kitchen floor with a familiar thud, the house still cool, smelling faintly of old coffee and the quiet dreams of his sleeping wife, Sarah. She'd be curled up in their bed, a soft murmur of a snore, and he'd watch her for a beat, a quiet love swelling in his chest, a love that was, ironically, both his anchor and his heaviest chain. Their 2 kids, Michael and Emily, were grown and mostly out of the nest now, Michael serving overseas, Emily plugging away at community college, but the echoes of their childhood still filled the space. The faded crayon mark on the kitchen wall, the slightly wobbly chair at the dining table. Memories. But memories didn't pay the bills. He'd make himself a pot of strong, black coffee, the first ritual of a day that was less about living and more about enduring. Then out to the garage where the familiar scent of oil and gasoline clung to the air like a second skin. His sanctuary, his prison. Another day twisting wrenches, another day fixing what was broken for other people, while the thing most broken inside him remained stubbornly beyond repair. The work itself was honest. He was good at it too, damn good. There wasn't an engine he couldn't diagnose, a tricky transmission he couldn't coax back to life. Customers knew they could trust Curtis. He was fair, he was meticulous, and he never cut corners. But as he wiped down tools, the first customer's cars already pulling into the lot, a familiar tightness would settle in his gut. It wasn't the stress of the job, not really. It was the weight of what could have been. He'd look around his small, independent garage, the one he'd managed to keep afloat after. Well, after a lot of things. After he'd lost the first one. After he'd lost everything. The thought was a raw, exposed nerve. The money, it was always just enough. Enough for the mortgage on the little house, enough for Sarah's groceries, enough for Emily's tuition, and to send Michael a care package now and then. But never enough to get ahead, never enough to build that cushion, that breathing room he craved. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter felt like a physical weight on his chest, each envelope a reminder of the endless treadmill he was on. This was his life, day in, day out. The rhythm of the wrench, the clang of metal, the smell of exhaust. And beneath it all, a constant, low hum of what he called the what-if engine rattling in his head. What if I'd done things differently back then? What if I'd trusted myself? What if I hadn't listened to that voice that told me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, strong enough? Because the truth was, Curtis wasn't just a mechanic. He was a craftsman, a natural entrepreneur with ideas that fizzed and sparked like welding torches. He had big dreams once, bigger than this modest garage, bigger than the steady but small paycheck. He'd seen opportunities, sketched out plans late into the night, felt the thrill of creation pulsing in his veins. He'd even started a promising venture once, poured every ounce of his savings, every spare minute, every drop of hope into it. But then the whispers would start, not from outside, not from Sarah, who was always his biggest believer, but from deep inside his own head. Are you sure, Curtis? Are you really good enough to pull this off? What if you fail? What will everyone say then? What if you lose it all? Again, these weren't just fleeting thoughts. They were corrosive, insidious doubts that ate away at him, brick by brick, until the solid structure of his belief began to crumble. He'd second-guess every decision, every instinct, every single move. A potential investor would show interest, and instead of confidence, Curtis would feel a paralyzing fear of being exposed as a fraud. A small setback would become monumental in his mind, proof that he was, indeed, not cut out for it. He'd start strong, full of fire, then the internal critic would take over, whispering its poison, until he'd become indecisive, hesitant, ultimately paralyzed. He'd pull back, make excuses, let opportunities slip through his fingers like oil through a sieve. He'd abandon projects just when they were on the cusp of breaking through, convinced they were destined to fail, not because of external forces, but because he was destined to fail. The business he'd poured his soul into, the one that was supposed to be his family's future, had eventually withered and died, choked not by market forces, but by his own profound, crippling self-doubt. He'd watched it happen, almost from a distance, feeling helpless as his dream turned to dust, taking his savings with it and casting a long shadow over their home. The shame of it had been a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to look Sarah in the eye. That weight, that shame, it became his shadow. It followed him into the long, dark hours before dawn and clung to him through the monotonous rhythm of his days. Now, instead of chasing the dreams of an entrepreneur, Curtis found himself rising to the shrill insistence of an alarm clock at 5 every morning. Not for a workshop he owned, not for plans he'd drawn up late into the night, but for a job. A steady, reliable job at Tony's Auto Repair on the less traveled side of town. He'd shower quickly, the hot water a fleeting comfort against the chill of the morning and the colder knot in his gut. A quick, silent cup of coffee, maybe a nod to Sarah if she was already stirring, her face etched with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd weathered storms and still stood firm. Then out the door into the pre-dawn quiet, the familiar scent of damp earth and exhaust fumes already in the air. His commute was short, the streets still mostly empty, the world slowly blinking awake around him. When he pulled into Tony's lot, the fluorescent lights of the garage were already humming, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of waiting vehicles. Hondas, Fords, the occasional beat-up pickup, each one a puzzle to solve, a temporary problem to fix. He was good at it, no doubt. His hands, strong and calloused, moved with unpracticed grace, coaxing life back into dead engines, tightening bolts, replacing worn parts. The smell of oil, gasoline, and antifreeze was a constant companion, familiar and almost comforting in its predictability. It was honest work, and he was an honest man. But it wasn't his work, not in the way he'd once envisioned. It was a paycheck, a means to an end. Every Tuesday, the bills landed on the kitchen counter like stones. The mortgage statement for their modest, single-story home, the electric bill, Emily's community college tuition, the occasional unexpected expense for Michael, thousands of miles away in the service. He'd watch Sarah's brow furrow slightly as she tallied them up, her quiet concern mirroring his own unspoken anxieties. They never talked about it directly, not anymore. The memory of the first business, the lost savings, the near loss of their home, that wound was still too tender, a ghost that lingered in the corners of their conversations. He knew what she was thinking, though, even if she didn't say it. Are we going to be okay? And he'd nod, gruffly, assure her, and then work a few extra hours, staying late at Tony's just to make sure the numbers balanced. Inside, beneath the calm exterior of the dependable mechanic, the silence was deafening. Every broken-down car he repaired, every engine he brought back to life, served as a stark, painful reminder of the business he'd failed to save, the dreams he'd allowed to wither. He'd catch glimpses of his reflection in a polished fender or in the smudged window of a customer's car, and he wouldn't just see Curtis, the mechanic. He'd see the ghost of Curtis, the entrepreneur. The man who'd once sketched out blueprints for his own custom fabrication shop on greasy napkins, whose mind had buzzed with innovative ideas for engine modifications, for bespoke vehicle restorations. The man who'd believed, for a brief, glorious flicker, that he was capable of building something truly his own, something that would provide not just for his family, but for his soul. Those dreams weren't gone. They were just buried deep beneath layers of self-doubt and regret, like old tools tossed into a forgotten corner of a workshop, rusting slowly in the dark. They haunted him during the quiet moments. The drone of an impact wrench, the hiss of a pressure washer, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. They'd surface as a phantom ache in his hands, a yearning to create, not just to fix. He saw the gap, wide and unforgiving, between the man he was reliable, hardworking, quiet, and the man he knew deep down he could have been. The man who looked at problems not as obstacles, but as opportunities to build, to invent, to lead. The man who wasn't afraid to bet on himself. He carried it all silently. The shame of past failures, the burden of present responsibilities, the ache of buried ambitions. He built a wall around himself, a gruff reserve that kept others out and, more importantly, kept his vulnerability locked away. No more big dreams, no more risks, just the steady, unyielding grind. It was safer this way, or so he told himself. Safer to be the dependable mechanic than the failed visionary. Safer to blend in than to stand out and fall. His eyes, usually quiet and observant, held a flicker of that intensity, a shadow of the fight he'd once waged and lost within himself. A constant internal battle waged by a man who looked strong enough to lift an engine block, but whose spirit felt crushed by the weight of his own unspoken potential. The quiet intensity in Curtis's eyes wasn't just a shadow of lost battles. It was a constant reminder of the war he'd waged against himself, and lost, spectacular and tragic. He had seen the cliff's edge approaching, felt the ground crumble underfoot, yet he'd frozen, paralyzed by the insidious whisper of what if. He started a venture once, a machine shop, crafting custom components born from a passion that burned bright and true. Orders came in, the lathe hummed, the scent of cutting oil was a perfume of promise. But then the whispers grew louder. Are your designs truly original? Can you meet the demand? What if you fail them? What if you run out of money? What if you're not good enough? He'd second-guessed every material choice, every price quote, every expansion plan. He'd delayed, he'd hedged, he'd pulled back from the very brink of success, convinced he wasn't worthy of it, convinced he'd somehow mess it up. The business withered, suffocated by his own indecision, taking with it not just his savings, but a piece of his soul. The real crack didn't happen in an instant. It was a slow, agonizing splintering. But there was a moment, a specific Tuesday afternoon, when the whole damn thing finally shattered. The for sale sign had been planted in their yard for weeks, a neon green monument to his failure, a constant, humiliating reminder. They'd done all they could, tried to catch up, tried to borrow, but the financial hole he'd dug with his aborted dreams was too deep. The final papers were signed, the deed transferred. Their house, the modest single-story with the neat, if simple, yard where their kids had scraped their knees and learned to ride bikes, was no longer theirs. He stood in the living room, a sterile echo now that most of their life had been packed into boxes. The late afternoon sun slanted through the empty window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Sarah was across the room, meticulously taping up a box of old photo albums, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each piece of tape was sealing away a memory. Her shoulders were hunched, a tired slump he knew too well. She hadn't cried in front of him, not really, not since the first shock had worn off. She'd been strong, impossibly strong, organizing, consolidating, trying to keep a brave face for Michael and Emily, who were away at college and military service, mercifully spared the immediate brunt of it all. But as she reached for another roll of tape, her hand brushed against a small ceramic bird, a gift from Emily when she was 6. It tipped, teetered, and clattered to the floor, breaking cleanly in two. A small, insignificant thing, really. But the sound, sharp in the silence, felt like a physical blow. Curtis watched as Sarah froze, her back still to him. Her hand slowly rose, covering her mouth, and her shoulders began to shake. A quiet, broken sob escaped her, small and ragged, quickly muffled. It wasn't the loud, angry cry he might have expected or even deserved. It was the sound of a woman, resilient beyond measure, finally buckling under the crushing weight of unspoken grief. That sound, that choked, quiet sob, was the trigger. It wasn't the foreclosure notice, not the bank's cold letters, not even the actual physical act of moving their belongings into a smaller, rented place across town. It was the raw, unvarnished pain in Sarah's tired eyes when she finally turned, eyes red-rimmed but defiant, and whispered, "We'll be okay, Curtis. We always are." He saw it then, laid bare. The desperate strength she had to conjure because he had failed to provide it. The quiet courage she mustered while he'd been paralyzed by his own fear. He hadn't just lost a house. He had wounded the very heart of his family, chipped away at the trust and security they deserved. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his bones, that it was his fault. Not the economy, not bad luck, not circumstances beyond his control. It was his own damn head, his own crippling self-doubt, his inability to believe in the gifts he knew he possessed that had brought them to this desolate moment. That night, alone on the lumpy pull-out couch in their new, temporary living room, the rental house silent and unfamiliar around him, Curtis stared up at the popcorn ceiling. 3 a.m. The digital clock on the dusty VCR glowed an accusing red. Sleep was a foreign country he couldn't visit. He lay there rigid, the silence amplifying the frantic, accusatory thoughts ricocheting through his skull. "You blew it, Curtis. You had it all and you let your own fear burn it down." He played it back, frame by agonizing frame. The initial excitement of the machine shop, the late nights designing, the pride in his first successful prototypes. Then the first doubt, the second, the endless loop of worst-case scenarios he'd conjured. He saw himself pulling punches, half-assing opportunities, always with an escape route, a reason to quit tucked away just in case. He hadn't fought for that business. He'd surrendered it not to external forces, but to the enemy within. The man in the mirror was a stranger he despised. A coward who traded potential for perceived safety, a fool who valued avoiding failure more than achieving success. What had his life become? A dependable cog in another man's machine. A good mechanic, sure, but a shadow of the man he'd dreamed of being. His hands, capable and strong, were shackled by his mind. He'd let Sarah down. He'd let his kids down. He'd let himself down year after year, brick by quiet brick, building a prison of mediocrity, all the while knowing he held the key. The memory of Sarah's quiet sob, the shattered ceramic bird, played on an endless loop. He felt a visceral ache in his chest, a self-inflicted wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He was 48 years old, and he had squandered his prime, not on grand failures, but on the quiet, agonizing retreat from ever trying. The shame was a physical weight, pressing him into the worn fabric of the couch, wishing he could just disappear into the cheap upholstery. The wish was futile. He couldn't disappear. He was there, present in the wreckage, watching it all unfold, piece by agonizing piece. The last box was sealed, taped up with a practiced, indifferent efficiency by the moving crew. They were good at it, these men who hauled away the remnants of other people's lives. He remembered watching his own father years ago, packing up their own failures, a quiet, defeated man. And now here he was, staring at his reflection in the empty, dusty space where their television used to be, a ghost in his own living room. Sarah moved through the house with a brittle grace, her movements too quick, too sharp. She clutched a small, chipped teacup, a wedding gift, as if it were the only thing grounding her. She'd already packed everything else. She didn't look at him, not really. Her gaze was fixed on the floorboards, the corners of the room, anywhere but his eyes. He saw the tight line of her jaw, the way her shoulders were pulled back, trying to appear strong for him, for the kids who were at Emily's friend's house, mercifully spared the final dismantling. But he knew her. He knew the slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept clearing her throat, the almost imperceptible clench of her fingers around that teacup. It was a dam holding back a flood, and he was the rising tide. When the lead mover, a burly man with a kind, weary face, finally handed him the clipboard for the last signature, Curtis just stared at it. The pen felt alien in his hand, heavy with the weight of finality. This wasn't just signing off on a truckload of furniture. It was signing away years of memories, years of effort, years of hope. Hope he had nurtured and then with his own 2 hands suffocated. He signed, the ink a dark, damning mark on the white page. "That's it, Mr. Miller," the mover said, his voice softer than before. "We're all loaded up." Curtis nodded, unable to speak. He watched them go, the heavy truck rumbling down the street, taking with it the last physical vestiges of their home. The front door stood open, a gaping mouth. He walked through the empty rooms, each echo a fresh stab. The faint squares on the wall where pictures had hung, the clean spot on the faded carpet where Sarah's old armchair used to sit. This wasn't just a house. It was the backdrop to Michael's first steps, Emily's crayon drawings on the fridge, shared laughter, quiet comfort, the steady pulse of a family building a life. And he had taken it all, crumbled it between his fingers like dry earth. He found Sarah in the kitchen, still clutching the teacup, her back to him, staring out the window at the familiar oak tree in what was no longer their yard. He knew what she was doing. She was counting the leaves, tracing the bark, anything to avoid turning around. When she finally did, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She tried a smile, a shaky, valiant effort. "Well," she said, her voice thin, "new chapter, right?" It wasn't a question. It was a desperate plea for reassurance, a lifeline she was throwing him, even as she herself was drowning. And in that moment, seeing her brave, broken smile, feeling the quiet, profound pain radiating off her, something inside Curtis snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, internal implosion. The dam inside him, the one he'd been building with excuses and self-pity for years, finally burst. He hadn't just failed a business, he had broken her. He had taken her dreams, their dreams, and shattered them, just like that ceramic bird. The shame was a searing brand, hotter and more unbearable than anything he'd ever felt. He had to carry it, this failure, and he had to watch her carry the pieces. That night in the rented apartment that smelled faintly of old cigarettes and desperation, Curtis lay awake. The cheap mattress sagged, unfamiliar and unyielding. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing light and even. He could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the tiny kitchen, the distant wail of a siren, the slow drip of a leaky faucet. Every sound was amplified in the oppressive quiet of the 3 a.m. dark. He couldn't close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw the empty rooms, Sarah's brave, terrible smile. He saw the face of his younger self, full of fire, full of ideas, full of a boundless, stupid confidence. He saw the countless opportunities he'd let slip through his fingers, the ventures he'd started with a bang and ended with a whimper, always just before the precipice of success, always because he'd found a way to talk himself out of it. Not good enough, Curtis. Not smart enough. Someone else will do it better. You'll just mess it up. He got up, careful not to wake Sarah, and walked into the living room. The moonlight cut a stark, cold path across the threadbare carpet. He sank onto the worn armchair, the springs protesting with a groan, much like his own soul. What had his life become? He was 48 years old, a capable mechanic, dependable, honest. But that wasn't it, was it? That wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was he was a man who had chosen to play it safe, to hide his light under a bushel, not because of modesty, but because of fear. Fear of standing out, fear of failing big, fear of succeeding and then having to keep it up. He saw it all with brutal clarity. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a victim of his own mind. He had been given gifts, a knack for building, an eye for business, a relentless work ethic when he chose to apply it, and he had systematically dismantled them, one self-doubting thought at a time. He had built an empire of not doing, a monument to what-ifs and could-have-beens, and the cost was everything. His business, his savings, their home, and worst of all, the quiet erosion of Sarah's faith in their future, even as she tried to shore up his own. The air felt thick, heavy with regret. He was staring down the barrel of the rest of his life, and all he saw was more of the same, a slow, inevitable decline into bitterness and mediocrity, dragging his family with him. He saw himself years from now, a tired old man, full of stories not of triumph but of retreat. The thought was a cold, hard stone in his gut. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 cuts from a dull blade, all self-inflicted. He deserved it. He absolutely deserved this agony. But Sarah didn't. His kids didn't. And that, more than anything, was the unforgivable sin. The man in the moonlight was a failure, a coward, a fraud. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that if he didn't do something, if he continued down this path, there wouldn't be anything left to lose. Not just material possessions, but the very essence of what made life worth living. It was all going to burn. The air felt thick, heavy with regret. He was staring down the barrel of the rest of his life, and all he saw was more of the same, a slow, inevitable decline into bitterness and mediocrity, dragging his family with him. He saw himself years from now, a tired old man, full of stories not of triumph but of retreat. The thought was a cold, hard stone in his gut. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 cuts from a dull blade, all self-inflicted. He deserved it. He absolutely deserved this agony. But Sarah didn't. His kids didn't. And that, more than anything, was the unforgivable sin. The man in the moonlight was a failure, a coward, a fraud. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that if he didn't do something, if he continued down this path, there wouldn't be anything left to lose. Not just material possessions, but the very essence of what made life worth living. It was all going to burn. He sat there, the plastic lawn chair digging into his back, watching the moon dip low. A quiet word, unvoiced but resonating in the deep chambers of his chest, made itself heard. Enough. Not a scream, not a plea, but a steel-cold declaration. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have an answer for how he was going to fix any of it. He just knew with every fiber of his being that the path he was on ended in ash, and he simply could not take another step down it. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator inside. He didn't know what came next, only that this paralysis, this surrender to the ghost of his own fear had to stop. The alarm clock shrieked at 5:00 a.m. A dull, familiar dread usually settled over him at that sound, a lead weight reminding him of another day of scraping by, of living small. But this morning it was different. He didn't hit snooze. He just swung his legs out of bed, the quiet resolve from the pre-dawn hours still a fresh imprint on his soul. He moved like a sleepwalker through the quiet house, past Sarah still dreaming, past the cold coffee maker. He walked directly to the garage, a place that had become less a workspace and more a monument to abandoned projects and broken tools. His gaze fell on the old, rust-pitted engine block of a small generator, shoved into a corner covered in a thin film of dust. It had been sitting there for months, a someday project, a reminder of a customer he'd let down with his indecision. His mind, the familiar traitor, immediately started its litany. What's the point, Curtis? You'll just mess it up. You'll get halfway through and lose interest. You always do. The voice was loud, insistent, a lifetime of self-doubt screaming in his skull. His hands actually hesitated, hovering over the wrench rack. The temptation to just grab a coffee, sit down, and let the familiar fog descend was almost overwhelming. But he remembered Sarah's eyes, the quiet strength holding back despair. He remembered the cold clarity of the moonlight. He took a breath, held it, and then with a deliberate, almost defiant movement, he reached out. He didn't know if he could fix that generator. He didn't know if he'd finish it. But he knew with that same silent, stubborn resolve that he was going to start. He picked up a wrench, then another. He pulled the dusty engine block onto his workbench, the metal cold and unyielding against his palms. It was just one small, broken thing, but it was a start. He didn't feel a surge of confidence or a burst of energy. He just felt the cold steel of the wrench in his hand and the stubborn refusal to listen to the whispers of failure. He began to work. The generator, that old Briggs and Stratton, fought him every step of the way. Bolts were seized, the carburetor bowl was caked with years of varnish, and a wire had chafed clean through. Each stubborn resistance was a fresh invitation for the old whispers to return. See, even this simple thing is too much for you. He felt the familiar knot of frustration tightening in his chest, the urge to slam the wrench down and walk away, to tell himself it wasn't worth the effort. His hands, usually so confident and precise, felt clumsy. Sweat stung his eyes as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn fuel line. The garage, cold and silent just minutes before, felt oppressive, suffocating. But he kept his focus on the task directly in front of him. Not on the daunting pile of other abandoned projects, not on the mountain of bills, not on the vast, terrifying chasm of his past failures. Just this one rusty nut. Just this one corroded gasket. He didn't think about success, he just thought about the next step. He gritted his teeth, found a bigger wrench, and applied more leverage, feeling the groan of metal as the bolt finally broke free. It wasn't a triumphant roar, it was a quiet, stubborn click. When the generator finally sputtered to life hours later, coughing thick blue smoke before settling into a shaky idle, there was no burst of joy, just a deep, bone-weary sigh of relief and the knowledge that he hadn't quit. Not this time. He cleaned up, locked the garage, and walked back into the house, exhausted but with a faint, unfamiliar hum of something akin to resolve in his veins. The next few days blurred into a grueling rhythm. 5 a.m. still came early, but instead of the usual dread, there was now a quiet urgency. He cleaned his garage, methodically organizing tools, throwing out broken equipment he'd been hoarding for years, not out of sentimentality, but out of indecision. Each discarded item felt like shedding a small piece of the old Curtis. He fixed an old lawnmower for a neighbor, then a rattling dryer for another. Small jobs, barely enough to cover the parts, certainly not enough to make a dent in the looming debt, but each one finished was another stone laid on a shaky foundation. Day 7 brought a real test. A customer, old Mr. Henderson from down the street, brought in his ancient pickup, its engine sputtering like a dying fish. Curtis. He'd said, everyone else says she's too old, too much trouble, but you always had a way with these old girls. Curtis opened the hood, his mind already churning through the possibilities, the years of experience whispering diagnostics. But then the familiar static began. You're going to mess it up. You'll spend hours, cost him a fortune, and it still won't run right. Why even bother? He found himself staring at a complex tangle of vacuum lines, a known weak point in that model, and his mind went blank. The old paralysis threatened to seize him. He wanted to walk away to tell Mr. Henderson the truth. "I don't know, sir. Maybe it is time for a new truck." The feeling was overwhelming, a physical weight on his shoulders. He felt the cold sweat on his brow, the familiar tremor in his hands. He felt his resolve draining, replaced by that sickening churn of doubt. He took a long, slow breath, forcing himself to focus. He closed his eyes for a second, seeing Sarah's tired but hopeful face, remembering the harsh moonlight on the floorboards, the silent vow. "No," he muttered, not to anyone else, just to the gnawing voice in his head. "Not this time." He forced his eyes open, picked up a diagnostic manual he hadn't touched in years, its pages yellowed and brittle. He started tracing lines, checking connections, his fingers slow and deliberate, fighting every instinct to rush or to despair. He spent the entire day on that truck, skipping lunch, ignoring the calls from other neighbors. He found himself looking up obscure diagrams, calling a former colleague in a distant town for an opinion, something he would never have done before, too proud to admit he didn't know. He worked until the streetlights came on, until his back ached and his eyes burned. He didn't solve it entirely, not that day, but he identified a faulty sensor and a collapsed hose. He ordered the parts, even though the internal voice screamed, "What if you're wrong? What if you waste money?" When the parts arrived on day 14, he installed them with a grim determination. He cranked the engine. It sputtered, coughed, and died. A wave of crushing defeat washed over him. The voice roared, "I told you so. You're useless. You're still that same failure." For a terrifying moment, he felt the familiar urge to throw his tools, to walk away and never look back. He leaned against the cold metal fender, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes, his knuckles white against the grimy paint. He was so tired. He just wanted to stop fighting. But then an image flashed, not of Sarah's pain, not of the cold house, but of the generator, that small, sputtering machine. He'd fixed that. He'd fixed other small things. He hadn't given up then. He forced his eyes open again. He hadn't failed. He had just found one more way it wouldn't work. He took another deep breath, pushing off the fender. His hand still trembled slightly, but he picked up his wrench again, his movements stiff but resolute. He wasn't going to quit. Not yet. He was going to try one more thing. He started rechecking everything from the beginning, methodically, stubbornly. He traced the fuel line again, slowly, inch by painstaking inch, looking for something he might have missed. He had to find it. He just had to. He traced the fuel line again, slowly, inch by painstaking inch, looking for something he might have missed. He had to find it. He just had to. His fingers, still trembling a little from the near capitulation, felt along the rubber, past the clamps, then around the metal pipe leading to the pump. He saw nothing. He felt nothing. The frustration began to build again, a hot, angry knot in his gut. Then, just as he was about to give up on that section, his thumb grazed something almost imperceptible, a faint stickiness where the rubber hose met the metal fuel filter. He squinted, pulling a grimy shop light closer. It was tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, a hairline fracture in the rubber where it had rubbed against a metal bracket for years, slowly, silently, leaking air into the fuel line. It wasn't a massive burst. It was a slow, insidious seep, enough to starve the engine of a consistent fuel supply, enough to make it sputter and die. A quiet aha escaped his lips, barely audible over the hum of the light. It wasn't a triumphant roar, not yet, but a deep, satisfying hum of recognition. He hadn't been entirely wrong about the fuel system, just about the exact cause. The voice in his head tried to interject, "See? You missed something. You're still not good enough." But this time it was softer, a distant echo. He knew what to do. He replaced the hose, this time double-checking the routing, making sure it wouldn't rub against anything. He bled the air out of the line, meticulously, patiently. Then he stood back, his heart thumping a steady rhythm in his chest. He turned the key. The engine cranked, coughed once, twice, then roared to life. A smooth, even rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It didn't sputter. It didn't hesitate. It just ran. Curtis leaned against the truck's fender, listening, a slow, tired smile spreading across his face. The sound was music. It wasn't just a truck engine. It was the sound of a small victory, a quiet rebellion against the doubt that had plagued him for so long. He worked on the truck for another hour, just tuning, tightening, cleaning, feeling the steady rhythm of the engine, absorbing the feeling of accomplishment. When he finally locked the garage door, the streetlights were on, casting long shadows. He walked into the house, and Sarah looked up from the kitchen table where she was paying bills. Her brow was furrowed with the usual concern, but when she saw him, her eyes widened slightly. "You fixed it," she stated, not a question, but a quiet observation. He nodded simply, "Yep." He didn't need to elaborate. The grime on his hands, the faint smell of oil and fuel, the subtle new lift to his shoulders, it all spoke for itself. He wasn't radiating triumph. He was radiating a quiet, determined peace. The next day, he walked with a little more purpose. He still got up at 5 a.m., but the thought of the mundane mechanic work didn't carry the same leaden weight. He tackled tasks with a newfound focus, a problem-solving mentality that had been buried under years of self-recrimination. He found himself humming under his breath, something he hadn't done in ages. Sarah noticed it first, of course. She saw him tinkering in the garage on the weekend, not with frantic, stressed energy, but with a methodical calm. He started taking on small jobs for neighbors, a sputtering lawnmower for Mr. Henderson, a leaky faucet for Mrs. Peterson. He didn't ask for much, just enough to cover parts and a little extra. But each successful fix, each grateful nod, was a brick laid in the foundation of his rebuilding confidence. He began to look at problems differently, not as insurmountable walls, but as puzzles to be solved. When a customer at the shop brought in a car with a baffling electrical issue, the old Curtis would have immediately felt that familiar dread, the fear of failing, of looking incompetent. The new Curtis felt a surge of curiosity. He'd dig into the wiring diagrams, consult manuals, methodically test circuits, trusting his process, trusting his eyes and hands. And more often than not, he'd find the answer. Weeks bled into months. The small garage in their backyard, once a repository of forgotten tools and dusty regrets, slowly transformed into a neat, organized workshop. He invested in a new diagnostic scanner, a proper workbench, sturdy shelves for parts. He wasn't trying to build an empire overnight. He was just doing good work, one job at a time, one satisfied customer at a time. The fear was still there sometimes, a whisper in the quiet moments, but it no longer paralyzed him. He'd learned to talk back to it, or more accurately, to just keep working through it. Do the next thing, he'd tell himself. Just do the next thing. He still looked like a man who worked hard with his hands, strong and dependable. But now the quiet intensity in his eyes was different. It wasn't the intensity of hidden anxiety. It was the focused intensity of a man who trusted himself, a man who had faced his demons and learned to live alongside them, even to lead them. He carried himself taller, spoke with a clearer voice. He learned to say no when he needed to, and yes, with conviction. He was still Curtis, the quiet mechanic, but inside an entirely new engine hummed. Sarah noticed it first, of course. She always did. Not just the lighter step in the morning, the hum of the engine from the garage, but the way his shoulders sat, unburdened. The line of worry that had etched itself between his brows for years slowly softened. He'd come in for dinner, smelling of oil and sweat, but with a different kind of tired in his eyes, the good kind, the satisfied kind. They'd talk about the day, not in hushed tones about overdue bills, but about a tricky engine he'd coaxed back to life, or a customer who'd left with a smile and a firm handshake. He wasn't just fixing cars, he was fixing something inside himself, and that healing energy spilled over, warming their small home. Customers began to spread the word. Curtis, he's got the touch. Honest as the day is long. He'll tell you straight what it needs, and he won't nickel and dime you. Trickle of work turned into a steady stream. He debuilt a small lean-to off the side of the garage for extra storage, added a lift he'd bought used but refurbished himself, making it sing again. The old fear of being overwhelmed, of not being good enough, would occasionally try to sneak back in, but he'd learned its voice now. He'd meet it with a quiet determination, a steady hand on a wrench, and a calm, deep breath. Just do the next thing, he'd still tell himself, and he'd do it. He wasn't chasing grand visions anymore, not the way he used to, with all the big plans and the bigger doubts. This time, it was about consistency, about integrity, about the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. He understood now that true belief wasn't some magic spark that lit up once and for all. It was a fire you had to tend daily, with small, deliberate actions. It was in the hours spent poring over a new diagnostic manual, in the patience with a difficult repair, in the simple act of showing up every single day for himself and for his family. One evening after closing up the now brisk workshop, Curtis found himself sitting on the porch swing with Sarah, the crickets chirping their ancient song. He watched the fireflies blink in the twilight, a peace settling over him he hadn't known in decades. You know, he started, his voice a low rumble. Folks always say, believe in yourself. Sounds good on a bumper sticker, doesn't it? He paused, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. But what they don't tell you is how your own head can be the loudest voice telling you you're gonna fail, screaming it sometimes. Sarah reached over, her hand finding his calloused one. She squeezed gently. You found a way to quiet it. He nodded, looking out at the familiar street, the modest houses, the life they were rebuilding, brick by painstaking brick. I learned you don't really quiet it, not completely. You just gotta tell that voice to shut up anyway. You gotta just do it. Screw up, learn, and do it again. The only real empire you gotta build is the one in your own mind, where you're the king, not the jester. He wasn't a rich man by the world's standards, not with fancy cars or a sprawling estate. But he woke up every morning with a purpose, a quiet strength, and the unshakable knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. His modest shop, Curtis's Garage, became a cornerstone of the neighborhood, a place where folks knew they'd get an honest fix and a steady hand. He had rebuilt not just his livelihood, but the very foundation of his being. He had built his empire, one bolt, one wrench.